Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm your hostess with maybe not the mostest, but at least I have something. This episode is our first in what will hopefully be many more travel adventures, where we'll be investigating forgotten places, small towns, and maybe rustle up a ghost or two. My husband and I recently took a day trip to Osawatomie, Kansas, population 4,255, give or take a few. Hopefully, my video skills will improve because at the moment, they really suck. I might have outtakes posted later that include the actual audio at the time, but there was so much background wind the day that we went that I've decided to narrate over the actual footage that I'll use. So let's start with a little background about Osawatomie. The name is a portmanteau of two of the primary Native American tribes from the region, the Osage and the Potawatomi. Osawatomie was the base for John Brown, that crazy-haired, wild-eyed abolitionist hero, and the area played a key role in the Civil War, which, in turn, with a lot of help from John Brown, ended slavery. The year after the Civil War ended, Osawatomie opened the first mental hospital west of the Mississippi. It was originally named the Kansas State Insane Asylum, and the name was changed in 1901 to the Kansas State Mental Hospital at Osawatomie. During the first few decades of its existence, there seemed to be a concerted effort by the newspapers at the time to only speak well of the hospital. The majority of the published reports seemed to be from visitors who only had glowing reviews. However, in 1876, the Daily Commonwealth newspaper out of Topeka, Kansas, published an unflattering article about the hospital titled "A Day with the Crazy People," which, coincidentally, if I ever vlogged my life, I could use that same title. So here's part of the article that was published. Quote, "An institution for the insane is generally called an asylum, primarily a place of refuge, a final home for the insane. Really, these institutions, our own especially, are hospitals where the insane are treated for their malady, cured if possible, and discharged if incurable. But every asylum is a sort of prison. There are gratings at the windows, and a prison-like aspect prevails. The disposition to escape exists more or less among patients and has to be guarded against. They are incapable of combining together in a plan of escape, but individuals occasionally display great cunning in obtaining their liberty. A patient once escaped from the Kansas asylum by means of a false key fabricated by himself. He was traced to some point in Missouri, and there the trail was lost and he was never recovered. So when a visitor goes into the wards, the door shuts behind him with a heavy clang, which every person must have felt rather than heard when ushered for the first time into a prison cell. But the first sight of a room full of insane people is far more distressing than that of a gang of convicts. The visitor to a prison steels his heart beforehand. He knows that he is to look upon the enemies of society, in a certain sense, his enemies, men, some of whom would kill him for $5 and burn his house over his family's heads to hide their crime. But the feeling which must overcome every heart not disciplined by custom and habit on first seeing a group of insane men or women is that of overwhelming sadness. In what are called the wild wards are confined the most violent patients, the class associated in our minds with bedlam. These wards are not, however, a scene of continual noise and violence, the moods of patients greatly varying from day to day. In a moment, a patient may change from perfect quietude to screaming violence. Frequently, they are treacherous and will make an attack at an unexpected moment. On the occasion of our visit, the wild men seemed on their good behavior. Several lay on benches asleep, and there was little talking done except by one man who wished some changes made in the management of the institution, and particularly wished to know when he was to be permitted to work out his road tax. The principal spokesman was the most remarkable inmate of the establishment, Captain Davis. This man is a singular character even for a lunatic, sometimes a violent maniac, at others merely mischievous, and again at intervals almost sane. To the visitor, Captain Davis is an object of interest, and his attention is reciprocated. It is his habit to practice his tricks on gentlemen he fancies are from the most remote rural districts. This man has had in the past a bad reputation for violence, has been confined in a straitjacket, and when visited last Tuesday was seated on a sort of cage, which for some time was his bedroom. Since Dr. Knapp has had charge of the institution, he has considerably improved. He speaks of his companions as these crazy fellows, and believes himself the victim of a joint conspiracy of the Odd Fellows and Masons. The shock head, seamed and wrinkled features, and the queer, incessant activity of Captain Davis must linger in the memory of every person who ever saw him. The grotesque fancies of insane men sometimes provoke a smile, but the sights and sounds of the ward of the wild women are simply horrible without a redeeming feature. Such hopeless faces, such blood-curdling sounds, such extremity of mental and physical suffering are heard and witnessed nowhere else. Seated in a rocking chair as we entered was a woman with snow-white hair and the most piercing black eyes we ever saw. Seeing a stranger, she started up and commenced pacing the room back and forth, her eyes flashing, and in a suppressed, excited voice, she poured out a volley of horrible oaths. This woman believes herself to be the Holy Ghost. Singularly enough, with all her hostility to sane people, she believes a sister patient, a grotesque-looking old woman, to be God the Father, and obeys her orders with the utmost submission. One very ladylike-looking patient, very neatly dressed, and with an uncommonly intelligent face, sat perfectly quiet during the visit, yet, when aroused, as she can be by a word, is one of the most ungovernable patients in the institution. It is said that this poor creature, shut up in a county jail in this state, and taunted by brutes who found pleasure in listening to her ravings. Well, I don't know about you, but the author of the article kind of sounds like a misogynistic a-hole. He practically doted on Captain Davies, but how very dare the women, right? The hospital doesn't allow anyone to take photos or film on the campus without special permission, and since I didn't have that, I didn't film. However, I did find these vintage photos of the hospital. The vast majority of the old buildings are no longer in use, and sadly, a lot of them are gone. There were tunnels that connected the buildings, but I don't know if any of them are accessible any longer. But can you imagine what it would be like to walk the tunnels at night when everything above you is quiet, or at least supposed to be quiet? There are numerous horror stories about how the patients have been treated in the past 160 years the hospital's been in service. And we all know that past treatment of mental health patients has been atrocious. But the Osawatomie Hospital has had issues even up until recent years. And of course, there are stories of hauntings on the hospital grounds. Shadowy figures have been seen, footsteps echo down empty hallways, and some describe hearing faint weeping as they walk between the older buildings. There have also been reports of hearing a little girl who cries early in the morning near the former children's ward. In an upcoming episode, I'll be reading an essay of one woman's experience at the hospital in the early 1940s, so we'll get a better idea of how things were. I found some reports online that the hospital would prepare every 2 years, and the reports begin at the hospital's opening and they go through 1958. They have all kinds of information in them, including the total number of patients that had been admitted from the opening of the hospital to the contemporary time of the report. It also had the number of patients that had died at the hospital. Between its opening in 1866 and 1900, about 26% of patients treated at the hospital also died there, and they didn't all die from old age either. By 1920, that rate had gone up to 38%. They had admitted a total of 11,023 patients, and 4,181 of them had died. By 1930, the rate was 39%. It remained steady through 1940, but by 1950, it had creeped up to 40%. So what was happening that made it go up? Well, the late 30s were the beginning of the heyday of electroshock therapy, although statistics show that particular cure was only fatal in 1 out of 1,000 cases. At least that's what they're telling us. It did, however, cause an increase in suicide. But according to the hospital reports, suicides were infrequent. But one of the main causes of death listed was exhaustion of something or another. There was exhaustion from mania, dementia, melancholia, convulsions, and the majority of them being exhaustion from insanity. and this could have been from patients refusing to eat or drink, or prolonged manic or psychotic episodes that could lead to cardiovascular collapse. It could have also been a catch-all for, oops, we tried a cure we shouldn't have. Patient abuse was also rampant, with patients being restrained for long periods of time. Patients were made to sit in rocking chairs along either sides of the long hallways, with nothing to occupy their minds or their hands other than the constant rocking. Another statistic in the reports that I found interesting is that there seemed to almost always be more married women in the hospital than married men. So, was that because their husbands had them committed, or did the men just drive the women crazy? In some of the reports, the supposed or assumed cause of insanity was also listed. Topping the charts was unascertained, but it was followed by ill health, heredity, epilepsy, sadly they thought it was a mental illness, and masturbation for the menfolk. And here I thought it only made you go blind. While I was researching the hospital, I came across the name of a woman, and for some reason her name stuck out to me. So I started researching her, and boy howdy did I end up down some rabbit holes. I'm going to make a separate episode about what I learned about her, too. The hospital once had a cemetery on the grounds, but in 1928 it was moved. A lot of the bodies ended up in 3 mass graves at the new location, and by a lot, I mean over 1,400. The cemetery is open to the public, and the last person buried there was Pearl Laws Coulter in 1960. The majority of the graves are simply numbered. No names, no dates of births or dates of deaths, nothing but a number. But 5 years ago, Sean Turney, a Kansas City area history buff, documented the cemetery and matched the numbered graves to the people who were buried there. So a huge shout out to Sean for his hard work and the dedication it took to provide people with their family members' final resting place. Graves 1 through 343 are deaths from 1928 to 1960, and graves numbered 344 to 346 are the mass graves from the burials prior to 1928. I found it incredibly odd that the mass graves are at the end of the cemetery, and all of these graves are lined up in number order. There have been stories that the hospital didn't move all of the bodies that were at the original location, but instead just built on top of them. I can't say if that's true or not, but I can say that there are a number of deaths that happened during the time there was a hospital on the hospital grounds, and there isn't a record of them being buried there. But that could just be that they were sent to the family so they could bury them instead of having them interred at the hospital. It is a very peaceful cemetery. When we were there, it was sunny with a breeze, and even though you could hear the highway traffic, there was still a quietness there. I did feel a heavy sadness there, but nothing creepy. Following severe floods in 1903 and 1904, the Kansas City Bridge Company was contracted to construct the Asylum Bridge over the Meridazine River, replacing a narrow bridge that was unpassable during flooding. The new bridge opened in December 1905. As the years passed, the upkeep on the bridge was neglected, and in 1979 it was closed to vehicle traffic. It stayed open to foot traffic until 1998, when it was permanently closed due to safety concerns. There are stories about the bridge being haunted as well, and I would imagine that going down there at night would be spooky. However, when I was there, like the cemetery, I only felt an incredible sadness. When I was standing at the bridge, I thought of all the people being taken to the hospital, knowing where they were going and what might happen to them there. I could imagine the bridge with its gas lights at the top, casting long shadows, and the creaking of the wooden slats as a horse and buggy traveled across it. And then the first cars carrying their bundles of heartbreak under those same gas lights to what could have been their final destination, knowing the horrors that lay beyond. Thank you so much for joining me for our first sort of road trip adventure. Please like, share, and comment if you think the video is something others would be interested in. I'll be back soon with the stories of the 2 women I mentioned who were committed to Osawatomie State Hospital. Until then, stay safe and be happy.